What's up, investors? It's the Russian dude. Here's the part that should make the Kremlin extremely uncomfortable. Russia may have just lost one of the most strategic pieces of occupied Ukrainian territory, not because Ukraine launched some huge direct operation, not because thousands of soldiers stormed the beach like in the movies, and not because Moscow suddenly decided to be generous. But because Russian forces, especially elite ones, apparently could not keep up their own troops supplied with the basic things an army just simply needs to simply stay in place and pretend that everything is fine. We, guys, are talking about the Kinburn Spit, a narrow strip of land northwest of Crimea that reaches into the Black Sea and controls access around the mouth of the Dnipro River. And if that sounds like some tiny piece of sand that only map nerds care about, this is exactly where the map becomes dangerous. Because this place can threaten routes around the Dnipro, serve as a potential Russian launching point towards Odesa, and also become a future Ukrainian platform for pressure towards Crimea. According to the reports linked to Atesh partisans, pro-Ukrainian sources operating around Crimea and inside networks connected to the Russian military environment, Russian forces may have abandoned or seriously weakened their positions there. And the reason is the part that really matters, which is logistics. Not another propaganda speech, not another staged meeting where everyone nods at Vladimir Putin like he personally invented grand strategy, but logistics. The boring and brutal reality that if food, fuel, ammunition and rotations cannot reach your troops on time, even elite soldiers eventually become people sitting at the end of the broken supply chain. And this is why today's story is much bigger than the Kinburn Spit itself, because if Ukraine can force Russian forces out of a critical position without directly pushing through every trench, then we may be looking at a possible blueprint for Crimea, southern Ukraine, and the next stage of the entire war. Here's where it gets interesting, because the Kinburn Spit looks small on the map, but small does not mean unimportant, especially in a war where rivers, bridges, ports and supply routes decide what armies can do long before politicians start pretending they planned everything perfectly. The Kinburn Spit sits northwest of Crimea, near the Black Sea and the entrance to the Dnipro River system, which gives it strategic value far beyond its physical size. Because whoever controls or neutralizes this area can influence military movement, maritime access, and the long-term economic life of southern Ukraine. Think about the Dnipro River as one of the Ukraine's major arteries, not just a river from a geography textbook, but a system tied to cities, trade and national survival. And that is why the unexpected comparison to the Mississippi River in the United States now makes sense. You're gonna understand exactly what I mean right now. New Orleans mattered historically because whoever controlled access around the Mississippi could shape trade and military movement across a huge part of the country. And in a similar way, the mouth of the Dnipro is not just a local feature, it is the strategic doorway. For Russia, the Kinburn Spit has been useful because it allowed Moscow to pressure Ukrainian routes, preserve a presence near the Black Sea, and keep alive the theoretical threat towards Odesa, even if that threat has become much weaker after Ukraine pushed Russia's Black Sea positions backward over time. For Ukraine, the same territory has the opposite meaning, because if Kiev can neutralize or reclaim it, Ukraine gains more freedom around the Dnipro, more pressure against the southern occupation structure, and potentially more room for future operations towards Crimea or across the river line. This is why this reported Russian movement matters so much, because this is not only about whether a few units left a narrow strip of land, it is about whether Russia can still hold exposed positions at the end of supply routes that Ukraine has been steadily damaging. The embarrassing part for Moscow is that these troops may not have been pushed out through a direct assault, but by the simple reality that Ukraine's pressure behind the lines made the position much harder to sustain, which is basically the military version of watching someone abandon an expensive office because nobody can deliver food, fuel or electricity anymore. And once you understand why this strip of land matters, the next question becomes even more important. The question is, how did Ukraine create a situation where Russian troops in such a valuable place may have had no good options left? And by the way, if you have already watched this episode on our Patreon, you already know the answer 10 hours ago. Because every episode is released there in early access, there is also an additional chapter at the end about ridiculous Russian propaganda. The link to our Patreon is down below, and your memberships are the best way to support our work. Thanks much, now let's continue. Now here's the part most people miss, because when people imagine territory changing hands, they picture a dramatic direct operation. But modern pressure often works in a much colder way, where the goal is not always to break through the front door, but to make the room behind the door impossible to live in. According to the reports previously mentioned, Russian troops on the Kinburn Spit may have been left in a situation where supplies became too difficult to maintain, which means the decisive pressure may not have happened on the Spit itself, but tens or even hundreds of kilometers away from there, where Ukrainian actions against logistics slowly turned into the position into a trap. That matters, because logistics are the invisible skeleton of an army, and when that skeleton starts cracking, the body can still look alive for a while, kinda. It can still appear on state television, and it can still even tell the public that everything is going according to the plan, but eventually the whole thing starts bending in ways nobody can hide. Food has to arrive, fuel has to arrive, ammunition has to arrive, damaged equipment has to be repaired or replaced, tired soldiers have to be rotated in and out, and command has to maintain enough connection with the position to understand what is actually happening. This is why the idea of elite Russian forces leaving the Kinburn Spit matters so much. Because elite units are exactly the kind of forces Moscow would prefer to keep in a strategically sensitive position, since they are more experienced, more capable, and much harder to push out than poorly trained replacements. But even elite troops cannot run vehicles just on slogans and promises by Putin. They cannot hold a position forever on just patriotic speeches, and cannot sit indefinitely at the end of supply line that is being squeezed from every single direction. That is the proof of concept Ukraine may have just demonstrated. You do not always need to directly overpower a Russian position if you can make that position logistically useless. Because once the cost of staying becomes higher than the value of holding, the map begins to change without the kind of massive direct push that drains people, equipment, and time. This is also why Ukraine's drone campaign matters so much. Because drones are no longer just battlefield cameras or headline machines. They are a part of a broader strategy reaching roads, ports, bridges, and every fragile connection that keeps Russian forces functioning across the entire occupied territory. And when the leader of Ukraine's drone forces says that Crimea could be totally isolated within a month, which is obviously a very bold statement, but it does not sound empty when the Kinburn Spit may be showing the exact mechanism Ukraine wants to apply on a larger scale. The idea goes as following. Do not chase every single Russian soldier across every meter of ground. Just make the ground itself impossible for Russia to hold. And that brings us to the source of this information, because the people who brought this story into public view are not just sitting safely into the studios or other countries, no. They are risking and they are taking enormous risks inside the Russian control system. Let's talk about them right now. Before we continue, there is something you should know, because this story did not simply appear from nowhere, and the source matters almost as much as the claim itself. The report of Kinburn Spit desertion comes from Atesh partisans, a pro-Ukrainian partisan network connected to occupied areas including Crimea. These are people with information from inside or around the Russian military environment, which means they may have access to details that normal observers do not. But that also means that every single public claim can increase the risk for the people involved, because when someone reveals information that only certain, very small number of people could know, they can attract attention, suspicion, and danger. From the outside, intelligence stories can sound simple. Someone reports something, YouTubers discuss it, viewers argue in the comments, and everyone moves on. But for people gathering this information inside occupied territory, every detail can become a personal risk. Now we should be honest about the uncertainty, because there are two possible interpretations. The first is that Russian forces truly abandoned or seriously reduced their presence on the Kinburn Spit because they could no longer sustain the position properly. And if that is true, then this is a major strategic development that could open new options for Ukraine. The second is that Russia may be rotating units, moving some troops out and replacing them with others, which is why even some Ukrainian official voices have reportedly been cautious about declaring the situation fully confirmed in public. But here is where even the best Russian excuse still looks bad, because if elite troops are being moved out of a valuable position, while less experienced soldiers are still stationed there in fewer numbers, that can still mean Moscow is downgrading the position, preserving only the appearance of control, or trying to hold territory without being able to use it effectively. If the Kinburn Spit was easy to supply, fully secure and central to Russia's future plans, why remove elite soldiers from such a sensitive area at the exact moment Ukraine is increasing pressure across the entire south? We can also compare Ukrainian caution here to earlier moments around Kherson liberation, when public skepticism did not necessarily mean nothing was happening, but may have reflected the need to avoid revealing too much before the situation fully developed. That does not mean Ukraine is about to launch a major operation tomorrow, or today, or next week, maybe even. And nobody serious should pretend to know that from just one single public report. But it does mean that the window of possibility may have changed. There are also credible rumors that Russia may be preparing a major mobilization in the fall, and if Ukraine wants to improve its position before Moscow adds fresh manpower to the battlefield, then the period before the potential mobilization becomes extremely important. So the Kinburn Spit may not be just a local story, but a warning sign for Crimea, because the same logic that may have made this position harder to hold is now being applied to the peninsula Russia treats like a sacred trophy, because ultimately the liberation of entire Crimea is the goal. Now please keep this next chapter in mind, because it will be important later. The Kinburn Spit may be the smaller version of the strategy, but Crimea is the price that makes the entire Kremlin nervous. Ukraine's drone commander has said that Crimea could be totally cut off within a month, and while that is an extremely confident statement, it lands differently when you look at what Ukraine has already been doing to the routes Russia uses to support the peninsula. Crimea depends on connections, and those connections are not magic, because despite all the propaganda about Crimea being forever Russian, geography does not care about slogans. A peninsula connected through vulnerable bridge, roads and supply corridors can become a strategic liability if those connections are systematically damaged or reduced. Ukraine has already effectively cut Crimea off from all land bridges into the territory, except the notorious Kerch Strait Bridge or Crimean Bridge. And even that bridge has been damaged enough that Russia is reportedly not using it for normal commercial shipments or heavy trucks in the way it would want to. That means the most famous symbol of Putin's Crimea project is no longer functioning as the perfect lifeline Moscow once wanted everyone to imagine. Russia still has some access, including pontoon bridges and remaining land routes, so this is not a situation where nothing moves at all. But the key point is that access has been reduced severely, and shipments into the peninsula have dropped by 2/3 in just 1 month. A 2/3 reduction is not a minor inconvenience. It is the kind of pressure that changes behavior, creates shortages, and forces commanders to make ugly choices about what gets priority. Food shortages and fuel shortages are also mentioned, and while those phrases may sound less dramatic than battlefield footage, they are exactly the kind of problems that make an occupation system feel brittle from the inside. Because fuel is movement, food is staying power, and shortages are how confidence becomes to rot. Then there is the port of Mariupol, which Ukraine has reportedly attacked and taken offline, at least temporarily. And that matters because if land routes are pressured, the Kerch Strait Bridge is limited and sea logistics are also vulnerable, then Russia's supply network begins to look less like a strong imperial machine and more like a collection of backup plans taped together by people hoping Ukraine does not hit the same weak point twice. Air support is not a perfect replacement either, because air transport is expensive, limited and complicated in a war zone shaped by air defense systems. So this is the larger strategy Ukraine appears to be building, which is pressure by land, pressure by sea, pressure against support infrastructure, and pressure against the illusion that Russia can permanently hold every single piece of occupied territory just because Putin says so on television. And this is exactly why the Kinburn Spit matters as a preview, because if a forward Russian position becomes unsustainable when supply routes are degraded, then what happens when the same concept is applied to the Crimea at scale? That is the nightmare scenario for Moscow, because Ukraine may not need to immediately launch a massive direct operation to the Crimea to change strategic balance, since solely isolating the peninsula can already reduce Russian flexibility, weaken morale, and make the entire occupation project look less permanent with every damaged route and every delayed shipment. And once Crimea itself starts looking less like an untouchable fortress and more like a complicated supply problem, everything around the southern entire frontline begins to shift. Here's the real reason all we talked about today matters, because the Kinburn Spit is not only about today's battlefield, it is about what Ukraine looks like after this war eventually reaches some kind of post-settlement or a new phase. If Ukraine gains control or practical dominance around the mouth of the Dnipro River, the country is in much better long-term position because river access, port security and trade routes are not just side issues, they are a part of a national survival. Then there are places like Kherson also, and cities further up the Dnipro River. And that matters, because Russian pressure around the river does not only affect soldiers and military planners. It affects the economic life of a country that needs to move goods, rebuild regions, and reconnect areas disrupted by occupation. This is where the Odesa example matters, because for a while many people thought that Ukrainian maritime trade through the Black Sea would be almost impossible under Russian pressure. But Ukraine eventually managed to establish a functioning steel grain corridor, proving that even when Moscow tries to turn geography into a cage, Kiev can sometimes reopen movement through patience, technology and pressure. If Ukraine can do something similar around the Dnipro system, even partially at least, then the value goes far beyond one map update, because it would mean more commercial confidence, more pressure on Russian positions, and a stronger Ukrainian hand in any future negotiation. This is exactly why Moscow should be worried about the combination of drones, logistics, and geography, because Ukraine is not simply chasing headlines for the sake of chasing headlines. It appears to be trying to make Russian positions less supplied, less connected, less useful, and less politically defensible. There is also a possibility that Ukraine could use weakened positions and future technologies, including ground robots, to reduce the human cost of reclaiming territory, which is one of the most important strategic ideas here, because Ukraine's challenge has always been how to restore control without paying an unbearable price in people. If drones can isolate, if logistics pressure can weaken, and if Russian units begin leaving positions they can no longer sustain, then Ukraine's path forward may not look like old-style massive direct pushes, but more like the slow collapse of Russia's ability to sit comfortably in occupied geography. Ukrainian officials, all the way from Vladimir Zelensky to the drone commanders speaking about Crimea, have sounded unusually confident, almost as if they are taunting Russia. And while confidence alone does not change the battlefield, confidence combined with visible logistical pressure is something Moscow cannot ignore. For Putin, this is the nightmare scenario. One single dramatic defeat he can explain away with one speech, but a chain of practical failures where a route becomes unsafe, shipments drop by 2/3, elite troops leave a strategic position, and just like that, suddenly the whole image of control starts cracking. And now we arrive to the final question. If the Kinburn Spit really is the preview, what happens when Ukraine applies the same pressure to Crimea, the occupied south, and every Russian position that depends on supply lines Moscow can no longer guarantee? That is the real story here. Logistics are becoming the battlefield, and the battlefield is becoming a test of whether Russia can actually maintain the empire it drew on the television maps. The Kinburn Spit may turn out to be fully abandoned, partially weakened, or officially explained as a rotation, but no matter which version becomes confirmed, the strategic picture still looks bad for Moscow. And if Ukraine can repeat this pattern around Crimea, where the Kerch Strait Bridge is limited, remaining land routes are under pressure, food and fuel shortages are being discussed, and Mariupol's port has been taken offline, at least temporarily, then Putin has a big problem that cannot be solved with just another staged meeting. This is why the next weeks and months could become very important, especially with the rumors of a possible Russian mobilization in the fall, because Ukraine may be trying to create facts on the ground before Moscow can add new manpower to a system that already looks overstretched. If the Kinburn Spit becomes the first clear example of Russian forces being pushed out, not by direct confrontation, but by the collapse of practical supply, then we may be watching the beginning of a smarter Ukrainian approach to reclaiming strategic space. Not fast, obviously, not easy, not even guaranteed, but extremely dangerous for the Kremlin. Because this is the kind of pressure that turns occupation from a political trophy into a daily logistical headache. Guys, if anything of this makes sense, please subscribe to our channel, like this video, don't forget about the Patreon, the link is down below. Thanks so much for watching, see you on Wednesday.
We won't succumb to their tricks, the facade they try to sell. Their twisted words and feeble claims on us all they cannot quell. We see through their lies, their feeble attempts to sway. We do not believe